From the street, nothing looked unusual. The curtains stayed closed, the neighbors carried on, and the rent kept being paid. But behind the blacked-out windows, entire homes had been gutted, illegally rewired and transformed into cannabis factories worth millions. This documentary aims to present an honest and unfiltered account of the cases surrounding two Vietnamese nationals linked to large-scale cannabis operations, Dinh Vuong and Thi Van. At the center of this narrative are the two individuals just mentioned, who operated within the framework of a much wider criminal model, Dinh Vuong and Thi Van. Dinh Vuong was documented as being 41 years of age at the time of his sentencing in 2026. While his exact date of arrival remains unspecified in court documents, he was a Vietnamese national who resided in New Zealand as an overstayer, who would ultimately serve as a frontline cultivator for indoor growing operations. His partner, Thi Van, was 57 years old in 2026 and presented a much different public profile than Mr. Vuong. Van had been living in the country since 2012 and was legally married to a New Zealand citizen. However, by 2018, she was living with and publicly described as Dinh Vuong's girlfriend. She was an unassuming small business owner who operated an Auckland flower shop, and she also served as the caregiver for her 103-year-old mother-in-law. Despite having no prior criminal convictions, Van's involvement with individuals linked to Vietnamese organized crime networks dates back to at least 2018. Through these connections and her seemingly legitimate business, Van possessed the network required to process staggering amounts of illicit cash. The couple first appeared on the radar of law enforcement in April 2018, after police executed a search warrant at a rental home in Pukekohe. Vuong and Van were found to be living entirely within the lounge of the property, having sacrificed the rest of the home to a highly sophisticated commercial growing operation. Across the 3 bedrooms, police located 62 cannabis plants, while a search of the unoccupied 4-bedroom home right next door, which was also rented by Vuong, uncovered an additional 85. The houses had been heavily modified to aid the indoor growing process, featuring heat lamps, ducting, carbon filters, light timers, and complex irrigation systems. The electricity for both properties had also been illicitly diverted, aka stolen, from another address to avoid detection. When confronted by authorities, Vuong admitted to cultivating the cannabis at both addresses, but attempted to convince police that the massive haul was strictly for his own personal use. The authorities didn't accept this explanation, and Vuong was subsequently charged with cultivating cannabis. However, the judicial process would come to a sudden halt. Vuong was scheduled to appear in court for sentencing in October 2018, but failed to show up, instead vanishing into the shadows as a fugitive. But while Vuong remained on the run, police were beginning to uncover operations of a far greater scale. Beginning in December 2021, authorities launched an investigation focusing on money laundering and drug dealing activities named Operation Bush. It was during the execution of an Operation Bush search warrant in July 2022 that authorities finally caught up with the fugitive Mr. Vuong 4 years later. Police raided a home in Mount Eden, where both Vuong and Thi Van were discovered to be living, and found nearly 5 kilograms of cannabis that had been packaged into large resealable bags for supply. The cannabis had an estimated wholesale value of between $49,500 to $88,000. Interestingly though, the most significant breakthrough of the Mount Eden raid was not the physical drugs, but the financial paper trail left behind. Inside a handbag belonging to Mrs. Van, police discovered over 500 cash deposit receipts, alongside bank cards in other people's names. Police also seized multiple cell phones belonging to Van, which contained numerous photographs of cannabis, as well as messages offering to sell the drug in varying amounts. The digital evidence revealed that the unassuming florist had actually operated a sprawling money laundering network, with court documents later describing her as the principal offender behind it. Investigators discovered she had utilized 76 distinct bank accounts to deposit $2.3 million. Of that total, $2.2 million was shifted to criminal associates in Vietnam via international money transfers and currency purchases. Van exploited her social connections to build the network. In 2021, she convinced a mutual friend to let her use her bank accounts, supposedly to make purchases for the flower shop. This eventually led to more than $100,000 of illicit capital being shifted through 12 different accounts, all registered in the friend's name. The pattern continued. Van paid another acquaintance $3,000 to open an ANZ account, then took control of the card and online banking details and funneled just under $900,000 through it. She also gained access to 13 accounts belonging to another individual and used her own business accounts to move further illicit funds. With the scale of the laundering network now exposed, attention shifted from the investigation to the courtroom. Yet the judicial proceedings for the Mount Eden cell would stretch out for years. For Mr. Dinh Vuong, he finally appeared in the Auckland District Court for sentencing in February 2026. Vuong faced up to 7 years imprisonment for the 2018 cultivation charge and up to 8 years for the 2021 charge of possessing cannabis for supply. In a bizarre defense regarding the nearly 5 kilograms of cannabis found at the Mount Eden residence in 2022, Vuong claimed they were the exact same plants that police had sloppily left behind from the original 2018 raid in Pukekohe. He insisted that after the raid, he had returned to the property, gathered the remains, and then had kept the plants for personal use. The sentencing judge, Belinda Sellers, swiftly rejected the explanation, telling Vuong that she did not accept his account and describing it as self-serving and simply not credible. The claim appeared especially difficult to believe after prosecutors obtained a police affidavit confirming that the entire 2018 Pukekohe crop had been removed and destroyed. Represented by Ron Mansfield KC, Vuong's defense argued that although the operation was large, he was merely a pawn within a much bigger system, stating that he was hardly a leader or boss, Mansfield said. He was a worker. The defense also pushed for sentencing discounts, pointing to the roughly 4.5 months Vuong had already spent in custody and the more than 3 years he had spent on electronically monitored bail following his second arrest. He's effectively served a sentence, if not more than a sentence, Mansfield argued. While Judge Sellers established a starting point of 4 years, she applied a 15% discount for his guilty pleas and mentioned that the discount may have been higher had he not fled in 2018 and waited until a week before trial to admit guilt on the second charge. She allowed a further 5% discount for his personal circumstances, acknowledging his claim of financial necessity, but most crucially, she agreed with the defense and factored in the extraordinarily long time Mr. Vuong had spent on electronically monitored bail, bringing the sentence below the 2-year threshold. And with that, Judge Sellers ordered Vuong to serve 2 concurrent sentences of 6 months home detention, noting that once the sentence was over, he would most likely then be facing deportation. For Mrs. T. Tai Van, it wouldn't be until early July 2026 that she stood before Judge Catherine Maxwell in the Auckland District Court, facing 40 different charges relating to large-scale money laundering and cannabis supply. These included 9 cannabis charges, 1 count of obtaining by deception, and 30 counts of money laundering. Van was initially accused of laundering more than $10 million, and despite prosecutors maintaining there was strong evidence supporting that figure, the amount was revised to a total of $7.3 million as part of a plea agreement. Van was also represented by defense lawyer Ron Mansfield. As he had with her co-defendant, Mr. Vuong, Mansfield portrayed Van as a minor player within a much larger criminal system and argued that her unassuming demeanor was exactly why overseas crime figures had targeted her to launder the money. She's not a sophisticated woman who has sought to engage in this activity on equal footing with others in the operation, Mansfield stated. He also suggested that part of the reason Van began offending in the first place was the financial strain caused by the 2020 pandemic lockdowns. The Crown Prosecutor Fiona Culleney acknowledged that although Van was not the overall leader, her role as a money launderer within the syndicate was still highly significant. She also firmly rejected the idea that the pandemic lockdowns had somehow caused the offending, noting that plenty of other businesses had struggled also through the pandemic, but somehow managed without adding money laundering to their business survival strategy. Taking these factors into account, Judge Maxwell established a starting point of 8 years for the money laundering charges, before adding another year for the cannabis offences. Although the defence had sought total reductions of 70%, the judge declined to grant discounts on psychological and remorse grounds, noting that the psychological records provided to the court were limited, and that Van appeared to minimise her offending during her pre-sentence interviews. Van was also denied a discount for the added hardship imprisonment can cause a foreign national, as she had lived in New Zealand since 2012 and was married to a New Zealand citizen. The judge ruled that the discount didn't apply. However, Van was allowed a total reduction of 25% for her guilty pleas and the effect her imprisonment would have on her elderly mother-in-law. And with that, the final decision was even more so decisive for Mrs. T. Tai Van, and she was sentenced to 6 years and 9 months imprisonment. The fallout from these large-scale commercial operations left a trail of severe collateral damage across New Zealand communities. Rental homes were left structurally damaged, illegal wiring created serious fire risks, and, in some cases, caused entire properties to burn down, while in East Auckland alone, nearly $300,000 worth of electricity was stolen across just 20 properties. The human cost was equally devastating. Investigations revealed that many of the Vietnamese nationals arrested inside the grow houses had been duped into traveling to New Zealand with false promises of legitimate work in construction or hospitality. Migrants would often pay offshore agents between $10,000 to $30,000 to secure their visas, only to be placed into illegal work tending cannabis plants as crop sitters to repay their supposed debts. The cases of Dinh Vuong and Thi Van represent only a fraction of a much wider offending model operating across the country. Parallel police operations revealed a broader and highly adaptive pattern involving residential properties, immigration arrangements, and Vietnamese organized crime networks. Operation Peruvian, for example, uncovered a large outdoor grow operation in Taheke, Northland. In late November 2022, police raided a rural property purchased by a Vietnamese client just 3 months earlier. Inside 11 newly built half-round greenhouses, 6 Vietnamese nationals were found cultivating 6,500 cannabis plants. The operation included large water reservoirs, industrial pumps, and piles of electric blankets used to warm the roots of the plants. Across the wider inquiry, police prevented an estimated $20 to $25 million worth of illicit cannabis from being sold. The investigations also exposed how organized networks manipulated New Zealand's immigration system. Operation Clementine, a joint investigation between police and Immigration New Zealand, identified 38 registered companies connected to properties being used to grow cannabis. 11 were believed to be completely inoperative, despite being linked to over 200 people holding valid New Zealand work visas. Immigration New Zealand responded by cancelling 62 visas before the holders could leave Vietnam, issuing 38 deportation liability notices and turning 14 people around at the border. Between July and August 2025, Operation Beryl and other Auckland raids shut down 120 grow houses, destroying more than 11,000 plants and 10 tons of cannabis in an estimated $58 million blow to organized crime. Less than a year later, a separate investigation named Operation Harvey uncovered the same offending model on a major scale, particularly in Rotorua. 25 warrants led to the arrest of 16 Vietnamese nationals and the seizure of more than 3,500 plants and 97 pounds of dried cannabis. These Rotorua properties alone were estimated to be stealing $30,000 worth of electricity each week. These investigations show that organized crime, like everything else, is constantly adapting. The cases surrounding the Vietnamese cannabis syndicates expose the complex machinery behind a multi-million-dollar illicit industry in New Zealand. Behind every seized plant was a wider system of exploited migrants, ruined rental homes, stolen electricity, and millions laundered through seemingly legitimate businesses. And while cannabis may have been the product, the damage it left behind reached far beyond the plant itself. What are your thoughts on the vastly different sentences handed down in these cases? Was 6 months home detention for Vuong too lenient, and was 6 years and 9 months imprisonment for Van proportionate to her role in laundering millions for the network? And what about the wider syndicates behind these operations? Have you ever encountered signs of this kind of activity, maybe somewhere in your own community? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found this documentary informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more in-depth explorations of often overlooked, lesser-known stories. Who else would you like to see us detail next? Your engagement helps us continue to shed light on otherwise unheard narratives.